Are we buying the hype too much on Bears players? Are we buying the hype on the Packers too much? Every team minus the Minnesota Vikings in the NFC North has a lot of hype. We'll be talking about that when we come on with the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to the RotoWire Fantasy Football Podcast. Jeff Erickson here with Nick Whalen. We're brought to you by Fantasy Football Knockout. We're brought to you by Circa and by Fantrax. The NFC North might be the best division in football. For my money, it's definitely the best top to bottom division in the NFC. And the Chicago Bears, I mean, there's a lot of optimism on this team after a few downtrodden years, Nick.
This is the most optimistic Bears fan has probably been in their entire life if they were born after 1985. I don't know if you've been watching Hard Knocks. That's just pouring gas on the fire. I've had a lot of discussions over the weekend in my heavily Wisconsin-based sports group chats. People sending Caleb Williams highlights to be like, all right, what's our concern level? What do we need to do about this? Are we panicking? The Bears have never had a talent like this at quarterback, right? I mean, I think obviously it's very much up in the air. Will Caleb Williams live up to the potential? Nobody knows at this point. He's done well through these first two preseason games, I think, to deliver enough highlights to feed that fire. But just the talent alone. I mean, the improvising, the throwing on the run. I mean, that's what Caleb Williams is almost more comfortable. That
this weekend. Yeah,
he's almost more comfortable, rolling left and whipping that thing across his body. I mean, it's unbelievable. That was a wild throw to Romeo Odunze down the sideline. He had another one in the preseason opener where he was rolling right and fired a dart. We saw Caleb Williams, kind of improvising as a scrambler. I think he does a really good job, especially if you watch that in slow motion. There's a good clip going around over the weekend where he's holding two hands onto the ball. Head is always on a swivel. He's not getting lost back there. It's not Zach Wilson, spinning around and just kind of looking out of sorts. Like, it somehow looks controlled when Caleb Williams is reversing field and outrunning defenders. He always knows, kind of exactly what the closing speed is. Like, how much time do I have to either get to the corner, to get around this guy, to get a throw off? Obviously, we saw that at the college level. We've seen it now in some preseason action. Does that work against NFL ones on a consistent basis? We will see. My stance on Caleb Williams, whenever I get asked about him, is I think he's either going to be really good or this is going to crash and burn. And I lean much more toward the former. I think he's going to be really good. Yeah. But I don't know that the way Caleb Williams plays, it's like, could he ever just be an average NFL starter? It just feels like it's either going to hit or it's not. It's like a supercharged version of Johnny Manziel, like a more talented, more controlled, more normal person version of Manziel, where it's like it never really felt like Johnny Manziel could just be like the 15th best quarterback in the NFL. Like, the way Caleb Williams plays, I think he's either going to be a star or he's going to struggle.
I think that's an interesting take, and I think you're not wrong. I think that, there's a lot to that. Noteworthy from, granted, we're trying to divine things from a player's second preseason game. The first two drives were against the Bengals' first team defense, and they were 3 and outs.
Yep.
That all the highlights came from the fifth and final drive. Sure. That beautiful throw, the touchdown scramble run, the play before the touchdown run caught my eye because this is another one where he's under pressure, scrambled. He did find Odunze in the back corner of the end zone. Odunze didn't get his feet down, but that was the type of throw that really kind of caught my eyes. Like, that's a hard throw to make, and he did it pretty readily there. That was the one that really impressed me.
Yeah, I think the vision and the awareness, has been there, certainly. And like you said, I think if you were just following preseason on Twitter, you thought Caleb Williams had like the greatest preseason game ever. That was really not the case at all. I mean, like you said, the Bears came out and went 3 and out on their first 3 drives. He led them to a short field goal drive after that, and then finally scored the touchdown at the end of the first half. Did play the entire first half of that game. DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, for what it's worth, played the first 3 drives, and then they were done. So it was punt, field goal, touchdown on 5 drives for Caleb Williams. Bengals rested Burrow, Chase, Higgins, even Zach Moss, Chase Brown, who's injured. Or not injured right now. I'm thinking of Jaylen Warren. So there were not a ton of ones out there necessarily for Cincinnati beyond those first couple series, but nonetheless, I still think, the flashes have been there for Caleb Williams. You've seen what you need to see, much like you have from Jayden Daniels. It's not all going to be great. Again, if you've been watching Hard Knocks, you've seen there's plenty of downs, even in practice. It's not like this guy is perfect, but the glimmers of hope have absolutely been there. And it goes back to what we said at the beginning. Like, the Bears have just never even had a quarterback who's capable of making some of these plays. And, I think there's going to be times this season where Caleb Williams overextends, tries to do too much, like any rookie quarterback does. And there's going to be some Shaq to the fool type of moments, I think, for him. But overall, I think the good is going to outweigh the bad.
Yeah, I tend to agree. Jayden Daniels goes ahead of Caleb Williams in most drafts, and I think it should be the reverse. But I get it because everyone is buying into Daniels getting the running yards, and I understand that. But in the NFFC, it shouldn't be that way, by the way, because it's 6 points for a passing touchdown. So although I mean, yes, it's just got to be an extreme number of yards. It's not just the rushing touchdowns; it's the rushing yards, obviously, too. I would take Williams over Daniels even this year. And certainly in Dynasty, I would.
Yeah, it's a debate. I mean, it depends on what you think the rushing upside is for Jayden Daniels, because Caleb Williams is mobile, but he's not a running quarterback. I still think he can give you a handful of rushing touchdowns. Kind of some of those improvising plays. He's certainly capable of running an RPO type of thing, but he's not Jayden Daniels in terms of like designed running plays for him 7-8 times per game. So I get the appeal with Jayden Daniels there, but like you said, in a 6 points per passing touchdown league, I would value Caleb Williams a little bit higher. It is close though, because of that rushing upside for Daniels. And the overarching point here too, when it comes to Williams, I've said this a million times, you're probably sick of hearing it. The best situation a rookie quarterback has ever gone into. I mean, not only do you have DJ Moore, who they just locked up with an extension, you're giving him Keenan Allen, who's just like the most steady possible veteran who still has, some left in the tank. You're pairing him with another top 10 pick at receiver in Romeo Odunze. You got a couple of tight ends, which we'll get into in a little bit. That's becoming interesting in Chicago. I mean, this is a team that, ran the ball fairly effectively last year. You bring in DeAndre Swift. You had a defense that was great against the run last year as well. Top to bottom, I think, more often than not, especially for a number 1 overall pick, you're walking into a Lions den. It's a barren roster. There's a reason that, they won 2 or 3 games the previous year. This is not that situation at all.
No. Wide receivers. DJ Morris just got paid as if he's a number 1 wide receiver. Is he a number 1 wide receiver? Is he getting underdrafted a little bit as wide receiver 19?
You could make the case that he's being a little underdrafted, but I think, there's some caution built in because he's no longer that ultra clear number 1 guy, as he was last season, as he was for most of his tenure in Carolina as well. So I think it's appropriate, right? To kind of build that in now. Like DJ Moore versus Michael Pittman to me is interesting. I think I might lean DJ Moore there. Mike Evans goes ahead of him, and obviously Mike Evans has done nothing but just give you 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns every single year. So it's hard to bag on that resume. But we had a lot of concerns about Mike Evans' age going into last season, and those just seem to have magically disappeared. Obviously DJ Moore is the younger player, just kind of entering his prime right now, and the Bears feel really good about him. You saw I think it was the first episode of Hard Knocks, so they got the extension done with him mid-practice. They had the conversation with Ryan Poles and some of the decision makers, and they essentially said, like, this guy has done literally everything that he promised that he would do. And you look at the numbers even last season for DJ Moore, for as bad as this offense was for a lot of the year. I mean, we were making a lot of Tyson Bagent jokes. Dude had almost 1,400 yards and 8 touchdowns, right? And it's like, if the quarterback play is even marginally better than last year, and you're building in, Romeo Odunze and Keenan Allen cutting into that, maybe he doesn't have quite as much yardage potential, but I think the overall competency jump at quarterback and for this offense overall should keep him pretty sustainable. So I think even with that talent around him, he still has a really high floor.
Yeah. And speaking of that other talent around him, Romeo Odunze is wide receiver 41. Keenan Allen's wide receiver 35. They got a pass catching back in Swift. There's a lot of different options. We saw Swift in the first preseason game have a big play. So that's definitely an option there. I have not found myself drafting any Keenan Allen. I do have a little bit of Rome. But I realize, he's not going to start in a day. He's going to have to work his way in. He'll play in 11 formations, obviously, but this is a team that has 2 good tight ends too. So they may not run a lot 11.
Yeah, that's the concern with the Odunze. And, I think there's a parallel between he and Jackson Smith and Jigba last season. He's going like almost the exact same spot where JSN was coming into last year. Mm-hmm. And, obviously Smith and Jigba came in behind DK Metcalf, behind Tyler Lockett. Like, I think we could see a very similar outcome this season for Odunze, which is still fine. It's like if he has a JSN like rookie season, I know it felt a little disappointing perhaps for Smith and Jigba last year, but I mean, it's really hard to be a top 30 fantasy receiver in the NFL right now. Like go look at the top 30 receivers at ADP and tell me how many of those guys you don't feel good about. I mean, there's just an insane amount of talent at the position right now. So I've been getting a little bit of Keenan Allen here and there just because he does go late enough. I still think he's going to be, perhaps a safety blanket in this offense for Caleb Williams. I don't have as much Odunze, in that range. I've actually been taking more JSN. I've been taking a couple shares of Cortland Sutton. I know it's super boring, but he is by far the number one in Denver.
Right.
Your guy, Brian Thomas, is creeping up on Odunze as well.
My guy. I like it.
Yeah, yes. Your guy. That's the guy in the Jaguars hat. Those ADPs have kind of grown closer. Most of that is Thomas himself, pushing up his value. But I mean, again, the fact remains, this is a really, really good wide receiver core. And I mean, if Odunze is that guy right away, there's a case to be made that this is like arguably the best 1, 2, 3 in the NFL, not just in the division.
Yeah. I agree. They're super strong trio of receivers there. Houston wants to argue about that a little bit.
Obviously, it's a little bit of a different situation where it's more depth based with the Packers. But again, there are plenty of teams that could throw their hat in the ring, but Chicago's in the discussion.
Yeah, for sure. Interesting. And we're going to go a little long on the Bears, but with the tight end situation there, Cole Kmet was someone that was drafted and started a lot last year. He's not getting all the first team reps. And in fact, they had one snap with 11 personnel where it was Everett and not Kmet that was on the field.
And that was even more so the case, in the first preseason game. And, I think that the general assumption is, Cole Kmet, he's the guy. I still think he's probably if I had to choose, one of those two, that's the guy I would rather roster. But you have to keep in mind, Shane Waldron is the Bears OC now. He had Gerald Everett, in the past. I think he's very, very familiar, with Gerald Everett from his days in Seattle. I think we're going to see both of them. Like you said, the 11 versus 12 personnel. I think that's going to affect both the tight ends as well as Romeo Odunze. How much are these guys all on the field? More than anything, it's just causing me to back away from the Bears tight end situation in general. I've been getting a little bit of Kmet in best ball, earlier in the year. We started to see his ADP tumble a bit at the NFFC. He's now going behind Taysom Hill, which is interesting. So I'm probably staying away from both of those guys. I think they could both be valuable real life options, but I don't think this is going to be fantastic for fantasy.
Comment from Johnny Vang saying, is Keenan Allen a concern? Playing at 230 pounds, looks slow and couldn't separate in preseason games. I think it's a concern. I think it's just his age is a concern. Just separation is a concern because, he's not a burner. He's a precise route runner. And so he's lost a little bit. That would be a concern for me.
A little bit, but no, you're right. The weight thing to me is like he'll get to where he needs to be. I don't know if he truly showed up out of shape or if he tried to bulk up or what. It's not somebody that's ever had like conditioning concerns or medication concerns in the past. So the weight thing to me, I think will sort itself out. But totally fair. Any receiver who is at his age, you're going to have questions about.
Yeah. So I agree. It's just a general concern, less weight based and just age and progression. And Odunze being there is something that second half of the season you might see him get marginalized a little bit there.
Yep.
All right, Chicago Bears. Let's take a look at their futures odds here. First of all, over under total, pretty for a team that has earned the number 1 overall pick 2 years ago and then got it via trade last year and still had a top 10 pick. Also, they're at 9.5 wins as their over under in most places there.
Yeah, that is a really high number for any team with a rookie quarterback. You don't see many teams. What's the highest right now? Is there even an 11.5 on the board? I don't know if there is.
There is. Chiefs and Niners at 11.5.
Chiefs. Okay. So those two are at 11.5, but still 9.5 is wild. And you'll see some 8.5s out there. If you go to DraftKings and select 8.5, minus 160 to the over. So that is pretty strong. It's plus 120 to the over at 9.5. So essentially, 9 wins is kind of the quote unquote consensus for Chicago. You look at the strength of schedule, they have the 3rd easiest schedule, according to Warren Sharp, for the season ahead. So that's certainly part of it.
Yeah.
I think they could get there, right? This was a team that, much like the Jets last season, where, the Jets won 7 games. You're just like, how the heck did this happen? Like, I don't remember the Jets winning a single game or feeling like they were in any games. The Bears found their way to 7 wins a year ago. So I think you look at the upgrade at quarterback, the upgrade with the weapons and Odunze and Keenan Allen. I think this should still be a pretty good defense, especially against the run. It's not it's not that crazy to think they could add 2 more wins. And, they also started the year 0-4 last year. They had that ugly week 1 loss to Green Bay. They really did not play well against Tampa Bay. They got smacked by Kansas City. They lost a gross game against Denver. So you can make the case that they left a couple of wins on the table, and the schedule should be easier than it was a year ago. Yeah, so I could get there with the Bears. I would take the under on 9.5, the over on 8.5. I think this is a 9-8 team.
All right, there you go. So we're officially calling this an under, but reasons, pathways to get there for sure. We're going to talk about the Detroit Lions, who might be the favorite here. But first, quick note from our friends at Fantrax. Is there something you wish your fantasy league had or features that are missing from your current leagues? Bonus scoring, custom schedules or playoffs, deeper team settings? Well, look no further because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college fantasy football leagues. Create or join a fantasy football commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top fantasy football draft platform in the industry. Coming from another service? Not a problem. Fantrax can easily import any of your current leagues and rosters. Ever have a trade go wrong or make a mistake in dropping a player? Fantrax Commissioner tools allow you to undo any move with one simple click. Fantrax is running a special promotion you don't want to miss. Sign up for free at fantrax.com/RotoWire today to enter for your chance to win tickets to any regular season NFL game for you and your entire league. Plus $6,000 in spending cash. That's right, tickets for your entire league. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing league for more chances to win. Simply go to fantrax.com/RotoWire and sign up today. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. We're also on the Blue Wire Network. Here are their ads. All right, let's talk a little about the Detroit Lions. For all the positive buzz the Bears get, for all the positive buzz that the Packers get, Jordan Love signing that big contract, it's the Lions who almost made the Super Bowl last year.
Almost made the Super Bowl and probably should have made the Super Bowl. I think if you would ask anybody on this roster or any Detroit Lions fan, the position they were in at halftime of that game against San Francisco, I think now you have to see them repeat it, right? I mean, last year was kind of the, let it ride. Everybody loves the Lions. They're a fun team. Can you actually now, with real expectations, repeat that kind of effort? And personnel wise, it's hard to poke holes, right? You're basically bringing back the same team. You have arguably the best offensive line in the NFL. You have a great ascending tight end in Sam Laporta. You have 2 really good running backs in Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. I think Jared Goff is still Jared Goff, but is a guy who's made a Super Bowl before. He made the NFC title game last year. He's proven that he can at least get you to that point. He's maybe not going to put the team on his back and win you that game, but if you surround him with enough talent like the Lions have, he could be a fine option. They bring in Terry and Arnold, who should start for them right away at cornerback. I know he's banged up right now, dealing with a pec injury, but should be back for the start of week 1. It's hard not to like the Lions, man. I'd still, in this division alone, it's like, I still think, like Jordan Love to me, if things break right, like they did over the second half of last season, he is the type of quarterback that can win you a game. Whereas I'm not sure Goff can. I would love to see that matchup in the NFC title game. I think that would be fascinating. But the only real quote unquote hole that I would say the Lions have is that second receiver position. There's still not a ton of depth here overall in the receiving core. Obviously, Amon-Ra St. Brown is fantastic. I think I'm lower than market on Jameson Williams. I am skeptical that he could be a true number 2. And beyond him, it's Khalif Raymond, it's Donovan Peoples-Jones, and then it's about a bunch of borderline roster guys. So, you're never going to put together a perfect depth chart, but the depth behind St. Brown at receiver is the biggest question mark for me.
Yeah. And God forbid he gets hurt, what happens? And, and I get, and it shows just like how much they're going to rely on Laporta, maybe in Gibbs, but both Gibbs and Laporta are banged up, by the way, too. That's the thing, but they both have hamstring issues too. So that's something to watch for. Yeah. They're really kind of counting on Williams to take that next step. DPJ, I saw buzz on him, maybe not even making the team. It's not even make the team season tweets.
That's right. Reverse buzz.
Yes. But Williams, we saw the big play in the game against the Niners, that end around where he scored. And I think he had another significant play later in that game. I forget. Didn't he also have a significant drop too? No. I know. We know
he had 2 touchdowns in that game. Both in the first half, I believe. Yeah,
that's right. He did. No, he didn't have drops. I'm sorry. I thought he had a drop too, and I know it was obviously Josh Reynolds had the killer drop.
It was Reynolds had the big one. Yeah.
Oh, like a fourth down one, and also the 2-point conversion too, if I recall correctly. Yep. But yeah. But yeah, you're right. That is still a moment of kind of vulnerability. I just it's funny because the Lions can look like the best team in football at times. And then they had like a 3-game stretch last year where they looked pretty vulnerable too. The Packers thrashed them on Thanksgiving. It was kind of an interesting comeuppance from the earlier game between the two teams, where the Lions thrashed the Packers. That was also a Thursday night game too. Weren't both games on Thursday night last year between them?
Yes. The first one for sure was. I remember that was like a where were you when type of game, and that was like when the peak of the Jordan Love concerns were coming out. I mean, the Lions just absolutely dominated the first half of that game. Green Bay, if I recall, I think they at least made it somewhat of a game in the second half and ended up being a 34-20 result. But the Lions completely dominated that game, and then Thanksgiving is when things felt like they started to turn for Green Bay. And the Lions got back on track. They beat the Saints the next week, but then they turn around and end up losing to Chicago in week 14.
Yeah.
I still think this is one of the steadiest bets in the NFC. I would not necessarily pick the Lions to win the Super Bowl, but I think they're the safest bet to win the division. I think they kind of have a system in place here, right? Like they know exactly what their identity is. There's not a ton of concern here. I mean, I think if they internally were as worried as I am about their wide receiver too, they would have gone out and done something about it. I think they're high on what Jameson Williams can be. I love the Montgomery Gibbs combination. I've talked at length about how I think, there's certainly some room for touchdown regression for David Montgomery, but I don't think it's all that much. You're obviously not worried about Jared Goff doing any tush pushes. You're not worried about him running in any touchdowns. Like I still think in the red zone, inside the 10, inside the 5, that's all David Montgomery.
Yeah, I think so too. Although, I mean, Gibbs ended up scoring 10 touchdowns last year. For a guy that doesn't get goal line carries, he got 10 touchdowns.
It's a team that could lead the NFL in scoring. Like there are a lot of touchdowns to be had here.
Yeah. The thing about the Gibbs is that now I think the Lions and Campbell are among the worst teams in divulging injury information. And Gibbs is, we expect him to be ready for week 1, but there's not really a timeline on him. He had a hamstring setback in the offseason as well. I do worry about that just a little bit.
Yeah, and we'll see. I mean, I think Gibbs is going to be fine. We just have to take it at face value. It's really the only option right now, but it wouldn't shock me if he's brought along a little bit slowly, not certainly to the level of last season, but for week 1, week 2, we'll see what that workload looks like. For what it's worth on Montgomery, top 5 in the NFL and carries inside the 5, inside the 10, and inside the 20 last season. Very, very quietly averaged 4.6 yards per carry. That was by far the best mark of his career. I think a lot of that can be credited to the Detroit offensive line,
which is still awesome. Yeah.
Which is great. Yeah. It should be even better than last year. I mean, Montgomery saw about 55% of the carries in the red zone. He scored 11 touchdowns on 31 attempts within the 10-yard line, which is very good. The Lions did use Gibbs in those situations. Like you said, he converted 5 touchdowns on 21 attempts within that same yardage. So Montgomery is still the more efficient player. Obviously Gibbs gives you more upside in general. He's going to be the guy who's catching passes out of the backfield. You're not going to get much, if anything, out of Montgomery there. But I still think where Montgomery is going right now is a pretty fair value. I've clicked on him a ton.
Yeah. Are you still willing to draft Gibbs at the 1-2 turn?
Yeah, I am. I mean, again, the upside is just ridiculous with him, right? I mean, I think he could be, I think you look at him, you look at Breece Hall, I think those guys are similar in some ways. I think, Hall's built a little bit more sturdily. That's somebody I trust a bit more. Is the injury enough to make me, consider Saquon Barkley? For sure. To make me consider just going with a safer option in Jonathan Taylor? Absolutely. But I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that of those 3, Gibbs could have the highest finish.
Yeah, I think I can see the upside, and yet I've been queasy about picking him there even before the hamstring injury because of the timeshare. But I get it. For all this talk about the Lions and how much they're going to score, nobody ever drafts Jared Goff in the top 12. No. And I know he doesn't run, but it seems like a little bit of a disconnect for me here. He threw for 4,500 yards, 30 touchdowns. What does he need to do to kind of get into that top 12?
I don't know if there's anything he can do. It's like I think he's Jared Goff, and people are always going to be a little iffy on Jared Goff until maybe it takes winning a Super Bowl. I don't know what it's going to take. He was the QB7 last year, so it's hard to say why he should be the QB15. I'm not going to say I would take him over Stroud or Richardson or Burrow, but I think like Jared Goff should at least be in the same conversation, or at least closer to the same ADP as guys like Tua and Purdy. And it's like, should Jordan Love be going 40 spots ahead of him? I'm not really sure.
Yeah. I don't think he should be, but
I'll happily take the discount. I'll tell you that. I have a lot of Jared Goff in these leagues where I wait on quarterback.
I was just going to say, like, a Daniels Goff combo is pretty solid.
Very doable.
Daniels Cousins, that I like that sort of range, is those two. I think Goff pairs well with those sort of type of guys. And that way you've got the ceiling possibility with Daniels, but you got the safe player early on too, if you want it.
Yeah. And for what it's worth, I mean, Goff was QB10 2 seasons ago, right? So it's like, even if you think last year was somewhat of a best case outcome for Jared Goff, like I think he has a pretty defined range. Like, barring injury, it's hard to see him dropping below like QB12, QB13 at worst.
Yeah. I agree. And Angelo points out Goff doesn't play outdoors until week 9 also. So
yeah.
And obviously plays all of his home games indoors. So that's always useful there. All right. Over under on the Lions, 10.5 wins.
I'll take the over. I think this is a pretty safe team. I really do. Again, if my biggest qualm is that, their former top 15 pick at wide receiver 2, if that's the big hanging up point for me, then, it's not the greatest argument. So I think this could be an 11-win team. Could certainly be even more than that. If things break really well for them, 12, 13 wins is totally on the table. I think when you have as good of an offensive line as they do, that to me feels more valuable than ever, especially for a team that loves running the ball like they do. I think they built kind of the perfect personnel around their skill players. So I think this is going to be a really good team. It's a good point by Angelo. They don't play outdoors until week 9 at Green Bay. The rest of their road games, by the way, following week 9, at Houston, indoors, at the Colts, indoors, at the Bears, week 16. That's not going to be a great setting. Week 17 at San Francisco. Like, not an easy game, but it's not going to be 25 degrees.
That's not a good playoff schedule, fantasy playoff schedule, though. At Bears, at Niners.
Well, I mean, even the final, 5 games of the regular season, or 6 games, are Chicago, Green Bay, Buffalo, Chicago, San Francisco, and then Minnesota in week 18, which for most leagues doesn't matter. But yeah, it's not ideal.
Yeah. So something noteworthy there for like best ball people, or if you're trying to set. I don't like to try to assume too much, though, especially 4 months from now, that the defenses will remain. That these are going to be tough defenses, or things can change so much in the NFL, just changes by the coaches and scheme and all that, let alone by injury. So it's tough to count on that too much there. We are going to talk a little Packers next, but first, quick note from our friends at Circa. We should do Circa because Derek Stevens owns Circa, is a big Lions guy. So anyway, the biggest pro football contests in Vegas are back. Circa Survivor and Circa Million are now up to 16 million in guaranteed prizes. 2 ways to win and no rake. Circa Survivor contestants select one team each week with no point spread. Last the longest to win it all, with $10 million guaranteed. In Circa Million, make 5 picks against the spread each week for your share of $6 million guaranteed. Quarterly and full season payouts. Enter in Nevada, play from anywhere. Visit circasports.com for details. All right, the Green Bay Packers were the first team to almost beat the Niners last year after thumping the Cowboys, leading to all this optimism this season. Team with great cap space issues, good young talent everywhere. Seems like it's good times in Green Bay.
The optimism could not be higher, I think, for the Packers, especially when you think about where this team was last season, not only going into week 1, but going into, week 9, where you're like, oh boy, this who knows what's going on with Jordan Love. At that point, they had essentially signed him to like a 1-year prove it deal. And halfway through the season, he had not proved it. But we saw a completely different version of Love down the second half. And, obviously they have all this depth at wide receiver. They go out and get Josh Jacobs. They have a real safety for the first time since like Nick Collins now, and Xavier McKinney. Finally have a new defensive coordinator, Jeff Hafley, who's drawn rave reviews specifically from the players who seem to love playing for Jeff Hafley. And If you followed Green Bay over the last like 4 years, nobody liked playing for Joe Barry. I mean, just the annexing of Joe Barry alone, I think will be huge for this defense. You're getting a full season out of Rashawn Gary, fingers crossed, who obviously missed the start of last season, wasn't even on a full snap load for most of the year. I still think he's one of the most underrated edge rushers in the NFL. You're getting Eric Stokes back. I mean, he's missed a ton of time over the last couple of years, a guy who looked awesome as a rookie a few years ago. Still some questions there as far as whether he can get back to that. I think the linebacker position on defense is still, it's always a weakness for Green Bay. That's probably their biggest hole on that side of the ball. But offensively, it really does feel like the sky is the limit for Green Bay. And it's a matter of how hard are you willing to buy in on that?
Yeah, for sure. In many drafts, including the RotoWire Vegas draft, Jordan Love went before Joe Burrow, often as the QB7, ahead of Dak, ahead of Kyler in many cases. I see it. And it's funny because I make the comparison between Jordan Love and CJ Stroud, and Stroud still goes ahead of Love everywhere, but who's to say that Love isn't better than Stroud this year? I mean, I think they're on similar paths. That second year as his full-time starter, talented collection of players supporting him. Lots of reason for optimism. It's interesting that I think because the Packers don't have that one big-time receiver, whereas the Houston might have more name value with like Stephon Diggs. I don't think Nico Collins is necessarily a bigger name than the Packers receivers, but we don't have the one identifiable alpha that maybe that there's a reason. But who's to say that Love couldn't be like QB4, QB5 this year?
He was QB5 last year. So it's very possible, right? I mean, a lot of those big games, of course, came later in the season. He actually got off to a really good start fantasy-wise, despite Green Bay looking shaky early in the year. I mean, he had 3 touchdowns, 245 yards in week 1 against the Bears. Had 3 more passing touchdowns in that weird game against Atlanta in week 2. He had a rushing touchdown against New Orleans in week 3. I mean, 3 straight, 20 plus point fantasy games to begin the year. Went through that really tough stretch, week 5 through 10 is when the Packers really felt like they were bottoming out. And then he's back with a vengeance at the end of the year, right? Capped off in 17, that huge win over Minnesota. That was his best fantasy game of the year, 28.5 fantasy points there. I think the floor is still pretty high with Jordan Love. You expect more consistency week to week. I actually think Nico Collins or Stephon Diggs would be the wide receiver 1, certainly in name value, but even in talent for the Packers. But nobody has a deeper 1 through 5 than Green Bay. And I'm including my guy, Bo Melton, in there, who's been playing a little bit more in the preseason than I would like. I don't know how solid his spot is going to be, but Watson, Doubs, Reed, Wicks, I mean, all these guys feel like almost equal threats. They all do, different things well. Christian Watson's the field stretcher. Doubs is kind of your classic possession receiver. Jayden Reed, they use all over. And, Wicks is kind of this young guy that we're still yet to see what the full potential is. And obviously in week 1 of the preseason, Jordan Love played 3 snaps, and one of them was a 65-yard touchdown to Dontavian Wicks, beating a number 1 corner for the Browns down the sideline. So it's hard not to buy into the optimism here. I think Detroit's like a year ahead of Green Bay. I guess we've seen Detroit put together a complete, really, really good season like last year. So I think this could be the year where, if Jordan Love is able to string together 17 relatively consistent games instead of these wild swings up and down, that's what will really cause a full buy-in. But the Packers are in the Super Bowl discussion. There's no question about it. I mean, is it a better roster overall than San Francisco? No. I still think I trust Philly a little bit more just because they've been through it. But I mean, Green Bay is in that mix. And again, I think Packers versus Lions for this division is live. I mean, either of those teams could take it.
Yeah. And it's interesting for all the optimism. And it speaks to how much they spread it around. But the earliest wide receiver drafted in the RotoWire Online Championship is Jayden Reed at wide receiver 37. He's a flex player, according to that. I think they might be slightly underdrafted, even though we can't identify who gets the main targets. I think it's frustrating. My point is, I want pieces of this offense. I want whether it's Reed or Watson or Wicks. I mean, I get Wicks because he's cheaper. But the thing is, if Watson does say that all that talk about Watson figuring out the hammy problems isn't correct, that he does have a setback with those hammies after all, or all of a sudden Reed's probably top 20 wide receiver. Probably, he's a wide receiver too. he's got that much upside. I think Wicks has got wide receiver 3 upside, maybe even higher. I mean, all it takes is the absence for one of these guys to kind of lift the others up. And so I want pieces of these guys. It's supposed to be a really good offense. The fact that we can't identify who the main target is, I think is, wrongly steering us away from rostering them.
Yeah, Watson is the skeleton key, I think, when it comes to evaluating this receiver core. I mean, because when he's been out there, like all he does is catch touchdowns and make explosive plays, right? Even last year when it felt like he barely played. I mean, he essentially played like 7.5 games. He had 5 touchdowns, right? And we saw that his rookie year. He got off to a terrible start. He was banged up. Aaron Rodgers lost trust in him. And then later in the season, he comes through with a span where he puts up 7 touchdowns in 4 games. So it's like, it's tantalizing to dream on the upside of Watson. And I think we have to be realistic. Like, even if it's not Christian Watson getting hurt, like the chances that all 4 of these guys make it through the season completely unscathed is pretty low, right? I mean, the top 4 receivers for any team, somebody's going to go down at some point, and it's impossible to predict who that might be. Watson's clearly the biggest risk of those 4, but I also think he has the highest upside. I think Reed is the safest option. If we're just kind of taking the random injury luck out of things, just because of the way they use him, the way he can move around, he could play basically everywhere on the field. They use him in jet sweeps. They use Watson in that way as well, for what it's worth. But, we saw it, especially over the second half of last season. Like when Jordan Love hit his stride over the second half of the year, Jayden Reed became his go-to guy and became a big part of that. So, it is a weird situation where we love this offense. We like Jordan Love. We're talking about them as a Super Bowl contender, and yet their first receiver off the board might not go until the 70th pick.
Right. Exactly. Romeo Doubs is the one that I feel like gets the least buzz among the 4. I think Wicks has his partisans. I really haven't heard anybody talking up Doubs.
No, and that's a great point, right? I mean, everybody, like, Wicks is the guy. I think if you're trying to come up with like a buzzy name late in the draft, it's Dontavian Wicks. And I think part of it is just because Doubs is just a boring receiver. I don't know how much Packers you watch, Jeff, but like he's not the guy making the highlight plays. He's the guy, making the contested catch on 3rd and 8 for a first down, but he's not the guy that's showing up in the highlight reel.
He's Tyler Boyd.
He is Tyler Boyd, and that's a compliment. I love Tyler Boyd. I mean, he's a younger Tyler Boyd, and he's been durable over these last couple of years as well. I mean, the week-to-week upside with Doubs just isn't there to me, and yet he was still wide receiver 36 a year ago. He's currently the wide receiver 50 in the NFFC, and I think if you're projecting Christian Watson to play, say, 14 games, then that probably causes Romeo Doubs to slide. There's certainly a chance that Wicks takes a step forward and maybe Doubs slides down the depth chart a little bit. But I think Doubs is arguably the steadiest of these guys. I think Jayden Reed is the safest for fantasy because there's more week-to-week upside, but Romeo Doubs is kind of that fail-safe guy of the 4.
Yeah, I think so too. Running back Josh Jacobs signs a deal here, gets his contract finally. Disappointing year last year, but I think a lot of people are buying back in on Jacobs.
Yeah, as they should. I think his cost is appropriate. He goes about 40th overall pick right now in the NFFC, RB 13. That places him between Rachaad White and James Cook, just ahead of Joe Mixon. We're talking 15 picks behind Isaiah Pacheco. I think those two have pretty comparable upsides this season. I found myself, slightly jumping ADP for Josh Jacobs. I'm not, where I stand on AJ Dillon. He's not good. We already saw it in the preseason opener where he, it was like 2nd and 1, and they gave him 3 chances to pick up 1 yard, and he couldn't do it. Part of that's on the offensive line, whatever. But AJ Dillon is supposed to be like the number 1 guy on the list who could get you 1 yard, other than Derrick Henry. And he just, this has happened so many times over the years. Like, I'm out on him. Marshawn Lloyd is interesting. Fumble issues. I don't think the workload is going to be there for him early on. Like, this is going to be Josh Jacobs' backfield by a mile.
Yeah, I think so too. I absolutely agree. And the Dillon thing is interesting because there's this mentality, big back equals converting short third downs all the time. And I think vision's more important than size. I see this. Ron Dane. Sorry to bring up another example, but you weren't even alive for Ron Dane. Come on.
Yes, I was.
At least not as a Badger. Were you? No, yes. I don't think so.
I was born in 92. He won the Heisman in 99.
Okay, so maybe the tail end of that. Yeah, you're right. It was 96, 97 is when I started to think of it. Okay, so yeah, you were 5 But still, he wasn't that great in the pros at short yardage situations with the Giants. He wasn't. Was it who's the other big Giant guy? There's another guy, and I'm blanking on
from Wisconsin or what team?
No, no, I think Auburn maybe, but I should get it, but it's sad to me that I can't recall that right now. But my point is, big guy isn't, not everyone's Jerome Bettis. Right. Just because you're big doesn't mean you're good at converting short yardage situations. And I don't know why I'm saying you're, but yeah, it is Jacobs. It is the other Jacobs. That was
Brandon Jacobs.
Brandon Jacobs. Absolutely. That's right. Thank you. Cow Chad. Appreciate that. But he wasn't especially good at short yardage either, I thought. And maybe it's just because he gets so much volume of those too. But anyways, we're getting far afield. So let's move on.
We are.
Quickly, tight ends. They have two of them, not just one. Musgrave and Kraft. Kraft is banged up right now.
Yeah, I think, Musgrave to me is the more interesting talent. I know our guy Joe Bartle, who basically doubles as like a freelance Packers insider. He's more of a Tucker Kraft guy. Kraft is dealing with a pec injury. They say he's going to be ready for week 1. We'll see. But to me, Musgrave is the guy that showed more kind of wow plays. Like he was a guy that was, injured at Oregon State, and, they basically drafted him fully on potential and measurables. Like he's a guy who had like 50 catches in his entire college career and 2 touchdowns, but Green Bay saw something in him. And he was the guy earlier in the season, ended up getting hurt and wasn't really back in the mix until the playoff game against Dallas, where he had a couple of flashes, including a touchdown. I think Musgrave to me is the more interesting player. I've been taking some shots on him, not as a tight end 1, certainly, but
right.
If you go early tight end and you want that second, or you wait and you're like, all right, I got Pat Freiermuth and I need to grab somebody else, I'll take Luke Musgrave. I think there's some potential there. And it's tough though, because of all these receivers that we just talked about, where you're like,
right,
I can't like all 4 receivers and then also say that there's room for, 1 or 2 tight ends to also be productive. Like something has to give here.
And that's why the market reflects that too. That's why he's tight end 18 and not a starting tight end. He's a bye week guy, matchup guy. Maybe, NFFC, he's pretty much always drafted because you have 20-man rosters. Right. In a Yahoo league with 10 or 12 teams and a 5-man bench, it might be hard to keep him there. So, yeah, that's interesting. All right. Over under on the Packers is 9.5 most places. You still see it sometimes you see it 10.5 at MGM. And I'm sure it's one of those where you want, you can pick your line at DraftKings and pay the juice accordingly there. If you want to do it at 10.5, you can get a good plus price. At 9.5, it's minus 135.
Yeah, I like the over on 9.5. I think this could be a 10-win team, and much like Detroit, 11, 12 wins certainly wouldn't be shocking for Green Bay. Going to Brazil and beating the Eagles would be, a heck of a way to get this thing started and get off on the right foot. In terms of the divisional rotations, they get the AFC South. So that means you get Tennessee. You'll take that. But you also get Houston. Jacksonville could be a toss-up game. That one is on the road in Jacksonville. Walking into that stadium in late October, good luck winning that game. They do get the Colts. They get the Colts for their home opener in week 2, which I think is a good spot, right? That'll be like the 5th or 6th NFL start of Anthony Richardson's career. And they also get the NFC West, which means the 49ers, of course, and the Rams, but some other winnable games in that division. They get the Saints as a rotational game. They do get the Dolphins, but they get the Dolphins at home on Thanksgiving Day at night. That is November 28th. Like that should be an advantageous environment for Green Bay. So a lot to like here.
Has Tua had any luck on the road in the cold? I haven't heard anything about that.
I'd have to look into the numbers. I think he's been better at home and indoors. Not 100% sure, but that's a good spot for Green Bay. Obviously you don't get the free wins against the Bears that it's felt like you could just bank for the last 15 years with Aaron Rodgers. Nothing's free against the Lions anymore. But you got to feel pretty good about your chances, to sweep the Minnesota Vikings as well. So I think this is an 11-win team. 11-6 is my official prediction for Green Bay.
Comfortably over. All right. Let's go with the Minnesota Vikings coming up next. But first, Fantasy Sports Knockout, where a fantasy league meets a knockout pool, an innovative take on fantasy football. The concept is simple. Choose a new fantasy lineup each week and score points the same way you would in any fantasy league. But you must choose your players wisely. You can only use each player one time. The lowest weekly score or group of scores is eliminated from the contest every week. The concept may be simple, but survival is not. How will you play? Load up early and play the matchups, or save the better players for later? Fantasy Sports Knockout. Can you survive the fantasy? Sign up at play.fantasysportsknockout.com today. All right, Nick, we got one more team left to cover today, the Minnesota Vikings. We've already had horrible news. Their rookie first-round quarterback, J.J. McCarthy, is out for the season, meaning they are locked in on Sam Darnold and Nick Mullins for the rest of the way.
Lock it in, baby. Sam Darnold season. I was operating under the assumption that Darnold would begin the year and eventually we would get the typical handoff to McCarthy. Even if the Vikings have said they want to slow play it, it was probably going to be, after their week 6 bye where we would see McCarthy, unless Sam Darnold just lights the world on fire, which is, he's shown no evidence that he can do that. I think the rub here is that now McCarthy is for sure sitting the entire season. And, even though he won't necessarily be able to be out there running around at practice and whatnot, there's still seasoning, that could be done. And, we've seen this work obviously for other teams, Green Bay being the pinnacle example over the last few years. So I don't think it's a total loss for Minnesota. Obviously you'd like to see McCarthy, but I also feel like the way he played in that first preseason game, poured maybe a little more gas on the fire than necessary. And, made us think like, man, this guy might be ready right away, which I still think is fairly unlikely. Most rookie quarterbacks just don't play all that well. I think it's easy to look at CJ Stroud and think that's replicable. That's just not usually how it goes. So I think realistically, it doesn't really change the course of like the Vikings season all that much in terms of wins and losses. I've said on our radio show, it doesn't really change how I think about Justin Jefferson. I think he's quarterback proof. I don't think there's that big of a difference between rookie year JJ McCarthy and, veteran retread Sam Darnold. Probably no change there. Right. Obviously a question mark, with Jordan Addison, who's banged up and could still have a suspension coming at some point. But Minnesota to me is clearly the team. It wouldn't shock. Like Chicago, things could go wrong. If Caleb Williams doesn't play all that well, they could finish last in the division. But I think Minnesota is kind of the consensus 4th team, the least exciting team, the team with the lowest ceiling for sure in the NFC North.
Yeah. And yet, they still have some playmakers there that are interesting there. Let's start with Justin Jefferson. Question in the chat is, how far do we let Jefferson fall? He's fallen to 7 in the NFFC. He's a wide receiver 5. Amon-Ra has now passed him. This might be an error. Amon-Ra St. Brown is as safe gets. I get it there. But Jefferson could be the 1.1. He was last year in drafts. I understand he doesn't have Kirk Cousins, but as good as Cousins is, I don't think he made Jefferson. I think Darnold could be a close approximation of that. We'll see what happens with that, but I almost think it's an error. We'll see about that. But then again, it just illustrates to me being in the middle of the draft's a pretty good spot to be. You get one of those guys. You're either going to get one of the top 5 receivers, or you're going to get I think there's a top 5 wide receiver group and a top 3 running back group. I like being in the middle of the draft this year.
Yeah, if you're getting Justin Jefferson with like the 7th pick, that's fine. Quarterback concerns aside, and right now he's actually going as the 8th pick on average in the NFFC. That's a pretty good deal. I think he's quarterback proof. We saw it even late in the season when Jefferson missed his time in the middle of the year, came back and put up 2 huge games with Nick Mullins at the end of the year, including a 30 fantasy point game in Week 18 against Detroit, 12 catches for 192 yards and a touchdown, 14 targets for him. Saw double-digit targets in all 4 of those final games once he was back up to speed. Mm-hmm. Again, certainly it's a downgrade from peak Kirk Cousins, who was great to begin the year last year. Like I'm not saying that's not a downgrade, but I don't think it's a fall off the cliff. I don't want to roster this guy type of situation. If no problem taking St. Brown ahead of him. If you think it's safer, I get that. In terms of per game production, they were right about at the same level last season. Justin Jefferson still gave you 20.2 fantasy points per game, despite playing 2 partial games last year with the injuries.
Yeah, exactly. So to be honest, I'm more concerned with Jefferson staying healthy than I am his quarterback situation. The hamstring was such a bad injury last year. That is a bigger worry to me than anything else. I think he'll be fine with whichever quarterback is the quarterback here. I don't think we got a situation like we had last year before Mullins took over there, where Josh Doubs was the quarterback. That would have hurt him a little bit more. But I don't. Otherwise, I'm not that concerned. Jordan Addison suffered an ankle injury last year. You alluded to that, and you alluded to his Sammy Hagar can't drive 55 tendencies. He's had now 2 vehicular issues since becoming a pro. Some maturity concerns. I even saw some buzz saying that, they're not going to try to sign him long-term when it becomes his turn. We'll see what comes to that there. But the question is, that is a concern. I mean, it's still year 2 of this guy. He's still 22 years old. So before we get too wrapped up in this, realize there's a lot of maturity that could still happen. A lot of good things that could still happen. Rookie season, he still had 10 touchdowns and 911 receiving yards.
Yeah, and I think probably less of touchdowns on the table as well. It was being targeted about 7-8 times per game when Jefferson was out of the lineup. Now, the Vikings had some other issues during that time. Obviously, Cousins had gone down, and they were kind of cycling through quarterbacks, so the offense was a little bit of a mess. But I thought, all things considered, this was a pretty encouraging rookie season for Jordan Addison. That Cincinnati game being the big standout. 6 for 111 and 2 touchdowns there. It's again, he played half the season without Justin Jefferson. He played half the season with Jefferson. Was productive in both of those stints. Even when Jefferson was going off for like 25 fantasy points a week in the first 4 weeks of the season before he got hurt, we still saw Addison, pulling in decent target numbers. He had 2 touchdowns the first 2 weeks of the year. The maturity stuff, it's really hard to say how you value that in fantasy. Like that feels like more of a real life concern, more of a long-term concern for Minnesota, but obviously it could leak into this season as well. I personally don't have a ton of Addison shares. To me, like I'm pretty confident in saying that Jefferson is quarterback proof. I don't think that we've seen enough from Addison to say that necessarily applies to him. In terms of
fair.
receivers going in his range, DeAndre Hopkins, Brian Thomas, Keon Coleman, Romeo Doubs, Khalil Shakir, like you're not paying an exorbitant price by any means, but I just, I feel like I'm drafting more running backs there. Sometimes I'm taking a tight end there. I don't have a lot of Addison.
Yeah, I don't either for many of the reasons you cite. This is a thin team, a very narrow tree. I mean, right now it's Jalen Naylor, Brandon Powell is the wide receiver 3. KJ Osborne is now in New England. TJ Hawkinson's not going to be ready for the start of the season. He's currently on the pup list. It's Josh Oliver, Johnny Munt are your other tight ends there. I mean, it is a concern that Jefferson's going to see a lot of doubles. I mean, I think he can beat him, but it is fine.
He's beaten plenty of doubles. Yeah. I mean, again, and you're not taking him 1-1. You're getting him sometimes as the receiver 4 or 5 in a draft.
Yeah, you're getting him 1-7, 1-8.
Yeah, there's a little more wiggle room here where it's like, obviously any receiver that you're taking in the top 8 picks, you're thinking, I want this guy to finish as a wide receiver 1, but there's a little bit more pressure when you're taking that guy 1 or 2 overall as opposed to 7 or 8 overall. So we're on the margins here, but there's a little bit more wiggle room, I think, for Jefferson to have some down weeks.
Yeah. So I'm seeing some pushback in the chat from this, and those who are listening in, I mean, how far, if you're showing this concern, you don't want to take Jefferson, like how far does he have to fall? Would you take AJ Brown or Garrett Wilson over Jefferson? Yeah. If you're that concerned. I mean, Nick and I don't think will, but
there's a debate. Garrett Wilson, there's a debate there. There's a debate, but it depends on whether you think Aaron Rodgers is staying healthy, because there's significant downside if he's not. But, I mean, Wilson, the numbers that Wilson has put up with the quarterback play and the situation that he's been in the last 2 years have been unassailable. So like I would consider Wilson over Jefferson. I don't think that's crazy.
And if you want to talk about narrow trees, go take a look at the Jets depth chart too, and talk about the number 2 wide receiver, the number 3 wide receiver there, and tell me that's any better than the Vikings situation there. The Vikings have a lesser running back, but it's still a pretty good one in Aaron Jones. So that's the other thing. So let's talk a little running back here. Aaron Jones, he's on a new team, division rival, revenge season for Aaron Jones here after last year being hurt so much last year. Are you in on Aaron Jones at price?
I think the price is appropriate, and he's been one of my favorite backs in the NFL for a long time. I think he's been consistently super underrated. Was fantastic at the end of the year into the postseason for Green Bay. I would not say I did a video on like some potential running back busts a couple weeks ago, and I put Jones on the list. Like I don't think he'll be a total bust barring injury, but there's definitely some bust potential here. I mean, there is considerable risk, even for a guy who comes off the board, typically in the 5th or the 6th round. Like there are some safer options, I think, around him. He finished last season as the RB26 in per game value. We're not counting a couple of those playoff games in that. RB37 in total value. Obviously missed a ton of time, but it's not like this is the only season where he's been banged up. Like he has a long history of, these kind of nagging, soft tissue, lower body injuries that have caused him to miss time. He turns 30 in December. And, Green Bay was one of the best offenses in football. They were a top 10 run blocking unit last year, according to PFF. It's a downgraded situation to me. It's not Saquon Barkley or Derrick Henry going to, what's arguably like the best situations of their careers. It's like, yeah, he's the clear starter in Minnesota, but he's going from what we think could be one of the best offenses in football to now an offense that's quarterbacked by Sam Darnold and, doesn't have as good of an offensive line. So I don't know, man. I mean, Minnesota was bottom 5 last season in rushing attempts, rushing yards, dead last in rushing touchdowns. I think they only had 7 rushing touchdowns as a team. There are reasons we could point to for that, but I'm a little bit concerned about the combination of age, downgrade in situation, and then what I view as a pretty significant injury potential.
Yeah, for sure. And I kind of feel the same way. I'm still not quite, I mean, it's where I'm like a round away from taking a running back, but it's kind of hypocritical of me because I take James Conner instead of Jones, but James Conner gets hurt just as much.
Those two that's a tough debate. I've just found myself going Montgomery more often, which I know is boring, but I just want the floor.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's a good one, actually. I like that one too. It's an interesting spot there because it's like the start of that next tier. There's Connor, there's Jones, there's Ramondre who hurt people last year. There's Montgomery, there's Swift, and then you're in Zamir White, who lost a lot of carries this weekend. By the way, I think he's a guy that's going to start dropping some in drafts, but we'll see. Najee Harris is going to climb on the flip side because Jalen Warren's got hurt, so that's another that's going to move into that range. So we'll see what happens there. TJ Hockenson not going to be ready for the start of the season. Have you found yourself drafting him at all?
0 shares of Hockenson. We can't just completely erase, the type of player that he's been over the last couple of years. I mean, he's been one of the best tight ends in football, but the timing of that injury coming late in the season, trying to get up to speed, you got a new quarterback in here and Sam Darnold. I really don't want to play the waiting game with him. I think the cost has been pretty appropriate. He's right in there with Goddard, Hockenson, Freiermuth, Dalton Schultz. But I want somebody that I could depend on for hopefully a full season. So I've been staying away from Hockenson. I haven't really thought much about him.
My answer is always, I want to have tight end settled before it gets to that. I want to have, I like to have somebody by Ferguson. Ferguson is my drop dead point. Or not drop dead, but it's a cliff for me there. And I think failing that, then I'm probably going to have to draft 2 tight ends, and I don't want to have to draft 2 tight ends.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I don't mind the idea of if you go early tight end, and Hockenson falls a little bit, maybe there's some like late season upside there. But it's a really severe injury. I mean, what was it? ACL and MCL. And again, if Justin Jefferson, to me, the chat may disagree. He's the only guy who's quarterback proof here. And I think TJ Hockenson, even though he looked okay, after Kirk Cousins went down, he still actually maintained his production pretty well. So maybe I should give him a little bit more credit. But the injury just scares me away too much. So that's my Hockenson take.
All right. Very good. The Vikings over under, it's either 6.5, 7.5, where depending on where you look. So I'll let you choose which over under you want and pick it.
Well, 7.5 is way easier. So I'll take that one and I'll take the under. I think this could be 5-6 win team. Schedule wise, they actually, according to Warren Sharp, have the toughest schedule in the division. They did finish 3rd last year based on tiebreak with the Bears. But whereas Chicago gets the New England Patriots on their schedule, the Minnesota Vikings get the New York Jets. And, where Chicago gets the Carolina Panthers, the Minnesota Vikings instead get the Atlanta Falcons. So there's a couple, of those rotational games that come back to hurt them. Yeah. They do have a winnable game in week 1 at the Giants. So there's a chance they could get off to a good start. But after that, man, it is brutal. San Francisco, Houston, Green Bay, the Jets, Detroit, the Rams, the Colts, and the Jags in consecutive weeks. I mean, there's a pretty decent chance that the Vikings will be dogs in all of those.
Can't walk into Duval and expect to win. That's for sure.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
We're at FanDuel is one of the places where it's 7.5 and it's way juiced. It's minus 168 on the under for what it's worth. But then again, at DraftKings it's 6.5 and it's minus 140 on the over. So there's a little like that. You have to do some searching around to find the right price and the right juice there. But I think I think the under seems like a good bet for me too. When you especially phrase it that way, which means there's going to be a lot of pressure on, do you keep Darnold in there at some point in time? Do you look at to Nick Mullins to try to unlock? Yeah, we'll see.
There's a pretty decent chance that Nick Mullins starts a handful of games here, but yeah, I mean, you're pivoting to other Darnold-like options. You don't have the option now to pivot to McCarthy. So I think in that scenario, they're probably going under. If Nick Mullins starts 3 games at some point this season, that means that this season is off the rails.
Yeah, I think so too. All right. That's going to wrap up our two-a-days here. We did NFC East earlier. You can catch that wherever you catch your podcasts or just here on YouTube as well. And now we finished the NFC North. If you like this, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to check out more content from RotoWire, please check out rotowire.com/pod. It's no credit card required, folks. It's just a free, just all you do is put your email address in. You get a free couple of days behind the paywall. Check out our draft kit. I highly recommend you check that out if you're not already a subscriber. Again, that's rotowire.com/pod. Big thanks to everybody. Thanks for chiming in on the chat, everyone. Really appreciate the activity there. Take care.